Hi, this is Jerry, and this is the third installment of our Unitarian Universalist history. And as I've mentioned before, really this is a history not of just Unitarian Universalism, but it's a history of people who dared to think reasonably and compassionately about what religion should be. So this is not just about Unitarian Universalists. It's about progressive, liberal people who question religion and see that as a good thing. And I think you'll find out as the weeks progress that it's a good thing someone does that. Let me bring up and I neglected to bring this up. Let me bring this back up here. Here we go. Our actual history program. Here we go. And we're in England. And let me make sure I'm sharing that. Yeah. Here it is. There we go. Slideshow. We did it. And we're recording this segment so that folks can watch us later, at a later point too. We're in England. And of course, a lot of Unitarian thought had made its way to England from Transylvania and from Poland, where the Sicilians, also known as the Polish Brethren, came to be. But also, as a reminder, the thoughts of religious progressive people who question the religion of their day, usually they don't depend entirely or even a great deal on the thoughts of some other people from some faraway country. These ideas occur to people naturally. So while we'll talk about how the English were affected very much by the Sicilians in particular, you know what? A lot of them figured out that the religion of their day needed some work. They figured that out all on their own. One other general thought today, we study, for instance, in some detail, the Unitarians and the religions in general in England, because you have to study what you are not to fully understand what you are. I think just about everyone would agree with that it's good that you understand other religions of the world, how they changed, and that gives you a better definition of yourself, a better sense of yourself, and how you might go forward and perhaps, if you see fit, to make some changes that you deem necessary to your own religion. The Reformation in England, as I've mentioned before, was very modest compared to what happened on the continent with Martin Luther in Germany and John Calvin in Switzerland. English Reformation, or I should say the Church of England that Henry formed after he broke with the Catholic Church, has oftentimes been described as Catholicism without the Pope. Perhaps that's a bit too basic, not a truly good definition, but there is some truth in it. Henry did not allow the priests to get married. The ritual was very, very similar, but the Pope was no longer in his road. This would change when Henry died. His son Edward became a very adamant Protestant. He said priests could no longer be married. This was the era when many churches, statues, stained glass windows were destroyed in England. Some of the ruins still exist, I believe, but it's an era that it's easy to find that disturbing, because even though they disagreed very much with the Catholic Church, and young Edward wanted to have a Church of England that was much more Protestant, very different from Catholicism, still it seems natural for us to wish that so many things hadn't have been destroyed. I guess that's a topic for another day, but the destruction was just amazing. Partly what we'll see here in England is a back and forth between Calvinists and the people who want a Church of England to be still what we would call very similar to the Catholic Church that they abandoned. So there's a back and forth, an arguing, and it goes back and forth very quickly, really. For example, Mary, who came after Edward, and this is the famous Bloody Mary, and please don't confuse her with Mary, Queen of Scots. That's a different Mary. But Bloody Mary, and we'll see why she really did earn that name, she wanted the return of Catholicism, really. She was anti-Protestant. She said, no, you priests that just got married, you need to get divorced again and go back to being celibate, unmarried. You can imagine how that went over. And it's this kind of back and forth that we see in England that, well, it informed the English nation, and then in Europe, some of these religious squabbles, and this is an understatement, this bickering, these religious wars had a great effect, especially in Western Europe, where churches nowadays very sparsely attended. Something like 6% of people in England attend any church. Going to church on Sundays is an American thing. We're told that about 40% of all Americans go to church. That number may be a little bit inflated. Numbers do get inflated at times. But all of this is just to say that the bickering, the wars, the fighting in general seems to have left a collective bad taste or a bad memory in the minds of Europeans. And it has come down to this day where religion is thought of as a source of strife and just not to be attended very frequently. Elizabeth then, the first, comes along, and she does what she can to make amends between the Catholics and the Protestants, wants to bring them together, much more pragmatic, and we'll see that she's also much easier on dissidents, has fewer deaths beside her name. And then James the First, a Calvinist, takes the English back in the other directions towards the Puritans, the theology of John Calvin, also known as Reformed theology. And then, finally, Charles the First. And again, this is considerably later, 1625, known as almost a Catholic, anti-Puritan. And so you can see when you look at what's going on here, a lot of change and a lot of chaos in England as far as who, what the religion of the day should be. Now remember, Arians, and that's anyone who wanted to subordinate Jesus somewhat. Anyone who wanted to subordinate Jesus were thought to be the followers of Bishop Arius back from in the 4th century, when the argument originally started as to whether or not Jesus was exactly the same as God, of the same substance, or was there a time when he was not? In other words, he was not eternally coexistent with the Father. But there are many Arians in England at the time, subordinationists, and of course, they had been reading the publications of Faustus Socinus, or I should say, of the Polish brethren, who came to be known as the Socinians. Let me back up one here. The books that the Socinians published were quite small and very easily concealed. They published nearly 36 titles, the Socinians. And these books made their way across the continent. They were written in Latin. And so the people who were very interested in the ideas of the Socinians were, generally speaking, quite educated. They could read the Latin, the Latin books, and it was not uncommon in this era for there to be quite a few Socinians, and well-educated, rational. Oh, and just what I was mentioning, it took place in the 4th century, where Arius, here on the left, was facing off against Athanasius, who incidentally, in essence, won the battle. And over the period of the next 100 years or so, the full doctrine of the Trinity that came into being, and Jesus then was indeed God. So just to brush up a review on who Arius was, and yes, how anyone who wants to demote Jesus, make him even a little more human, can be called, even to this day, an Arian. And there were many Arian Christians. Just to review our first program, there were a lot of Arian Christians down through the ages too. It's important to look at what I call the body count, I guess. It gives you an idea of what was happening in England. Here's up to Henry VII, some religious dissidents killed. And remember, a lot of these dissidents were Anabaptists. These were the folks mainly on the continent, in and around Germany and elsewhere, of course. And their main concern was that baptized infants, they didn't think that infants being baptized would be efficacious. That is, if you got baptized as an infant, it wasn't going to save your soul from hell. Of course, they had other things that they emphasized. They wanted to get back to the Christianity of the time of the Bible in Acts, soon after Jesus' death. They wanted to be very much a biblical Christianity, and to some extent ignore the Christianity that came into being in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, when Christianity was getting defined with all sorts of doctrines that, well, they weren't necessarily a part of the Bible. The people who formed the doctrines claimed that they were, but not necessarily so. Everything was arguable about the Christianity that developed later in the 3rd and 4th century. The Anabaptists just wanted to read the Bible, figure it out themselves, and they wanted to re-baptize infants, people who had been baptized as infants, hence the prefix Anna, A-N-A, as in Anabaptists. They wanted to re-baptize people, and that you can imagine that would be very upsetting to folks who consider themselves good Orthodox Christians, because it questioned the power of the church. To say that what a priest did when they baptized a baby was no good, quite a threat to the putative Orthodox Church. Henry VIII, some persecution and executions of dissidents, mainly Anabaptists again, some Arians. Edward the Sixth, very few. And then here again is so-called Bloody Mary. 280 people killed. Elizabeth, a much more moderate ruler, trying to make amends, to bring the people together of different religions, the Calvinists, in with the Church of England folks and those who wanted to return to the Catholic Church. That was Elizabeth, something of a peacemaker. And then James I, and this is interesting, James I burned a book. And the book he burned was the Racovian Catechism, that is, the book of the Socinians, Racovian as in from Racow, the home city, the main city of the Sicilians. James I had the book burned in full, what would we say? Full fashion. He had the hangman do it. And as a note, when you burned someone's book in those days, at least in England, you had the hangman do it. It was a kind of execution. And although you may not be able to get your hands on the person who wrote the book, in this case, Faustus Socinus and his followers, the Sicilians, if you couldn't get your hands on that person, that heretic, you would at least burn their book and you would have the hangman do it. Incidentally, the book that he was burning, the Racovian dedicated to just more of a moderate than he really was. Well, obviously he took umbrage at that and ended up burning a copy, at least one copy of the Racovian Catechism. It's about this time that the Articles of Religion come about. And in order to be in good with all of the powers that be, if you were a minister, if you wanted to go to a university, if you wanted to hold public office, you had to subscribe, was the word that was used. You had to subscribe to the Articles of Religion. If you didn't do that, your life would be considerably harder. You couldn't be a minister in the Church of England, couldn't run for public office. And the later act, much later act, the Act of Toleration, which comes later that we'll talk about, was not in fact very tolerant at all. Remember, it's at this time that there are a lot of Arians in England at the time, and those folks are in trouble with the Anglican Church all of the time. And so, where is Socinus in this? Again, 36 different titles in and around Europe and England. Here's the Catechism, the Racovian Catechism that we mentioned. Also, Michael Servetus, who we talked about at length, his books, although burned almost to extinction, his advocates are certainly round and about. So it's a sign of the times that religious dissent is a very real thing. And it's not making it easy on the rulers of England to come up with a Church of England that satisfies everyone. Just another note about the Socinians. Remember, what what a revolutionary theology they had. Jesus was human. They didn't believe that Jesus' death on the cross brought salvation to people. They didn't believe in infant baptism either. And they didn't believe that, or rather I should say, they believed in separation of church and state, a very controversial thing at this time. The Church of England was, of course, established by the government, supported by the government. That's the way things worked back then. But Socinians didn't believe in that either. And as we'll see, this will have a profound effect in England and then in America. The idea that the religion of your country, or rather the government of your country, should not support the religion, that they should be separated. A very radical idea at this time, as it would be on our own shores when the Pilgrims and other Puritans made their way here. At about the same time, another force that's stirring things up, and perhaps that's an understatement. We talked about Jacobus Arminius in the Netherlands, about how he is refuting John Calvin's idea of predestination. And without making Arminius sound like some very, very liberal person, his ideas were very different from Calvin's. While Arminius would say, yes, people are at least partly depraved. Remember, Calvin was saying that the human soul was entirely depraved. that the image of God in a human being was irrevocably broken, and that if God should save just one person, it was an act of unimaginable grace. Arminius, on the other hand, in the Netherlands, a professor, this was no ordinary person making these claims. It was a professor of theology, well respected, and that's why it came off as such a threat to the Orthodox Calvinists. Arminius would say that humans could participate in their own salvation. They could do something to keep out of hell. Of course, Calvin's idea of predestination was simply God decided a long time ago who was going to hell and who was not, and there was no good thing a person could do. If a person has been predestined to hell, there was no good thing they could do to get out of going to hell. And conversely, if a person was predestined by God to go to heaven, there was no bad thing they could do to get out of going to heaven. It was all set in stone. Arminius would say, no, a person can participate in what happens to them in the afterlife. And moreover, he would say that people had to participate in order to be good Christians. Well, this came off as such a threat. There we go. More about Jacobus Arminius. And as we'll see here, there are still, he started a church, or I should say his followers started a church, the Dutch Remonstrance. That means they were rebelling, protesting. They were Remonstrants. And there's still a few of them around today. They're very Unitarian in terms of theology, very liberal. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And as that slide mentioned, a lot of people in England, if they can't get into a university because they are a dissenter, they go to the Netherlands to study in a college, influenced no doubt by Jacobus Arminius. And they come back from the Netherlands, being Arminians now, and they come back and do their thing to liberalize England. The Calvinists are so threatened by the thoughts of Arminius that they hold the Synod of Dort, 1618. And they reaffirm what Calvin had said. I'll read just the bottom part. People without the regenerating grace of the Holy Spirit, they are neither able nor willing to return to God, to reform the depravity of their nature, nor to dispose themselves to reformation. In other words, God has decided this, and no, people aren't good enough to participate in their salvation. This was a very a strong reaffirmation and a repudiation of the Arminians. And just to explain what Arminianism means today a little bit more, today's Methodists, Episcopalians, obviously Unitarian Universalists, the effects of Arminianism, the lightning up effects of Arminianism were far-reaching. The Church of England would be Arminian in many respects. Calvinism, characterized by the early congregational churches that, incidentally, most of which became Unitarian in the coming centuries, but also the Presbyterian Church is, of course, Calvinist of the Reformed doctrine. Calvinism became something of a minority theology, especially the aspects of predestination. It'd be a good question to find out how often in a Sunday sermon in the Presbyterian Church or in other churches that have maintained a Calvinistic theology. Perhaps some congregational churches, although very few, given that they joined together with other churches and became the United Church of Christ, a very liberal church. There are some Calvinists left around today. That's an understatement. But I have a feeling that a lot of that Calvinism, the emphasis on predestination and hell, has softened down through the centuries. While we're talking about Arminius and the Netherlands, it seems natural to ask, why did that happen there? This progressive attitude, this questioning of Calvinism, because remember, the Netherlands was very much an area that John Calvin's Reformed theology took a hold very early. So this is like asking, why did Unitarians develop and prosper in Poland? Why did they do the same in Transylvania? Perhaps there are many reasons. The Netherlands, not unlike Transylvania, where Unitarianism developed, was a crossroads. A lot of people coming in and out. Tolerance, to some extent, can develop in that kind of a situation. William of Orange, an important figure from history, had this thing about protecting heretics. That would be a good read to figure out why William of Orange was something of a religious progressive person. And yes, there was a lot of influence from Polish Sicilians, Transylvanian Unitarians. There were a lot of universities in the Netherlands. And if you remember right, if you remember Dr. Biandrata, who made his way down to Poland and Transylvania to take his liberal religious thoughts, he was educated in the Netherlands as well. So just a long, long history in the Netherlands of what we would call progressive religious thought, reasoning, questioning things like the Bible, questioning orthodoxy, whether it be Protestant orthodoxy or Catholic orthodoxy, either way. And so by 1625, it was the most tolerant nation in all of Europe. Let's try that again. My mouse is, there we go. Meanwhile, in 1608, this is just shortly before the Synod of Dort that we talked about, Protestants, a group of them, leave England for Holland. And these aren't scholars who are going to Holland to get an education because they won't subscribe to the Articles of Religion and can't get into a university so they can become a minister. No, these are just folks, and they're Calvinists. These are Protestants. They don't like the Church of England. It's still too Catholic. So they go to the Netherlands because they know that they can go there and not be persecuted. They're not there long, though. And you may have heard different stories. You know, the story I always heard when I was in high school was that, or even perhaps grade school, was that they eventually decided to leave Holland after being there only a short time because their children started speaking Dutch. These folks from England, who would later be known as the Pilgrims, didn't want their children just speaking Dutch. They wanted them to remain English. And so they left and decided to go to the New World. Well, there's probably another reason, and that is the forces of the Pope were making life rough and headed towards the Netherlands. And so it's very likely that these pilgrims decided to get out of the Netherlands while the getting was good. And the picture is here as they're leaving the Netherlands for America. And as we'll talk a lot more about that later, pilgrims and just what, did they get liberalized while in the Netherlands? It's tempting to think perhaps they did imbibe, or as some historians will say, there's something about the pilgrims especially that lent themselves to becoming, and that already stirrings in them because, you know, these are our ancestors the great-great-grandsons and great-great-granddaughters of these pilgrims will become the first Unitarians in America. Just quickly, you know, the Puritans, as they're called, and pilgrims were Puritans of a type too. They wanted to purify the church, but they went one step further. They were separatists, and they wanted to break with the Church of England. When the Pilgrims made their way across the Atlantic and landed at Plymouth Rock, further south of Boston, as you know, they weren't interested in staying with the Church of England. They were separating, pure and simple. The Puritans, who formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were also Calvinists, to be sure, but they wanted to purify the Church of England. They still had some contact, although, as we'll see, the vast distance of the Atlantic, crossing the Atlantic, made it just about inevitable that both of these groups of people who wanted to get away from the Church of England, that both of these groups would end up becoming separate and make their own way, and finally, to the point, several hundred years later, become Unitarians. But to make the jump finally, to the father of Unitarianism. And yes, there's been a lot of dissident thinking going on. Arian thinkers, Socinians, anti-Trinitarians, by whatever name. And John Biddle, who had not at the beginning of his adult life read anything by the Socinians, he came up with this himself. This is the point I was making earlier about people don't have to read the thoughts of other progressive thinkers to suddenly decide, you know, I wonder if the Bible's 100% true. I wonder if the doctrines that were concocted during the conciliar age, the 4th and 5th centuries, I wonder if all that's true. You didn't have to read the thoughts of the Socinians or the Unitarians in Transylvania, or even Arminius. You didn't have to read any of those folks to come up with your own ideas that maybe, just maybe, Christianity should be something else. He refused to commit himself to the deity of Jesus Christ and would spend over half his life in prison. And he only lived to be 42 years of age. As we'll see, he died in prison. Did not live a long life. He did not believe in original sin. He didn't believe in an eternal punishment in hell. He's a Universalist, in other words. He believed Jesus was a man. And so he was a professor. And so wrote a lot of books. And he threatened a lot of people. That's why he spent so much time in prison. In other words, this Biddle was just he was no ordinary dissident. He had a voice, and that came off as very threatening. He was tempting fate. People were still being put to death at this time. That was not as common, of course. Mainly they were just thrown in prison, where oftentimes the person would die. They did burn his books, of course. His teachings made their way to Holland, the Netherlands. So his ideas were influential even in the already progressive nation, religiously progressive nation of the Netherlands. They decide to exile him first they decide to execute him, but Oliver Cromwell befriends Biddle. He likes him. They're both very learned people. And he says, no, let's just exile Mr. Biddle. He's only there 3 years. His friends talk him into escaping, a very dangerous thing to do. He comes home, and right away, he's back to preaching. Now, his small congregation, they meet in secret, of course. Doesn't make any difference. He's captured very soon. He doesn't have the money to buy his way out of prison. It was an enormous sum. So very quickly, he dies in prison. again, as I mentioned, a very common thing to do in those days. A prisoner's health was hardly something that the captors worried a great deal about. It's not too long after that finally the Toleration Act comes into being, 1698, but it wasn't very tolerant. They permitted you to be a Baptist, a Catholic, a Jew. You could legally exist. However, you were still referred to as a dissenter, a nonconformist. You couldn't hold public office. You couldn't serve in the armed forces or attend the universities. In other words, the Toleration Act, as I've said, was not very tolerant. Also, it's interesting to note that your church, you might call it that, but no one else could. You weren't allowed to call it a church. You might call it a chapel, but the only church was the Church of England. But another heavy hitter, shortly after the time of Biddle, a distinguished professor, good friend of Isaac Newton. In fact, Samuel Clarke would become known as the person who explained Newton to everyone else. He wrote widely about the thoughts of Isaac Newton, who, while thinking up his ideas, didn't do a very good job of putting it into language, explaining it to other people, disseminating his ideas, I guess would be another way of putting it. But Samuel Clarke understood the language. He was not just a theologian, he was a metaphysician, I think would be the word that would describe him. And he went about the work of helping Isaac Newton become understood. He's a very close friend of Newton. He could have been the Archbishop of Canterbury. But in about 1709, in order to get this promotion, he had to resubscribe to the Articles of Religion. Every time you made a big leap, moved up in the university, became a minister of a new congregation, you would have to resubscribe to this very, very Trinitarian document. Jesus is, in fact, God in the Articles of Religion, no doubt about that. He wanted to get his doctoral degree at Cambridge, and even though he didn't believe in the deity of Christ, he went ahead and said the words. But then, very quickly afterwards, he wrote a book around 1712, and he also revised the Book of Common Prayer. And Samuel Clarke's book makes it clear that he is an Arian, as also his revision of the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer. And of course, if you've ever attended an Episcopal worship service, you know the Book of Common Prayer is right there in every pew. It's their liturgy. And Samuel Clarke decided that he was going to make his own Book of Common Prayer. We might think of that as radical or even dirty pool, not quite ethical. But in fact, religion down through history has changed that way many different times. He had the effrontery, the gall, you might say, to do what he thought was a deconstruction, a mistake in Christianity of his day. And he was going to change it. And as you'll see, his nerve, the gall, if you will, that Samuel Clarke had ended up having profound effects for the first Unitarians in the colonies. Just quickly to look at the broader picture. I should mention, now that we're talking about Voltaire here, Voltaire would say of Samuel Clarke is the only Englishman that can think. Quite a statement for a Frenchman, where there was oftentimes no love lost between the French and the English. But Voltaire would say that Samuel Clarke was the only Englishman that knew how to think. Quite a compliment, really. Went along with Voltaire's sarcastic, even acerbic way of putting forth his ideas. He says here, of all religions, Christianity is without a doubt the one that should inspire tolerance most, although up to now, the Christians have been the most intolerant of all men. And he's an Enlightenment thinker, of which there are many. And the Renaissance that started in Italy, I think the date we gave it was approximately 1450. The Enlightenment is very much a continuation of the Renaissance that started in Italy and then spread throughout much of Europe. But so now it's the Enlightenment, and some famous Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Francis Bacon, Descartes, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, somewhat later Benjamin Franklin, and Joseph Priestley, who we'll talk a lot about. The Enlightenment's here, and it put an emphasis on the worth of human beings. And you know what? Most of the Enlightened thinkers didn't necessarily want to get rid of Christianity, but they did want a more rational Christianity. And a lot of times part of that is bringing Jesus, we might say, down to earth, more of a man, emphasizing his humanity. That was also part of the Enlightenment. And as we'll see, it gives birth to deism, which is one way of thinking about a kind of a Christianity that's very rational. And Jesus is human, according to the deists, but they consider themselves to be Christian in some sense. We'll talk more about the deists as we go along here. Jesus is just not divine to the deists. And of course, many of the founders of America, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, were in fact deists, not, as sometimes people will want you to think, good Christians. But on to Theophilus Lindsey. If Biddle was the father of Unitarian thought, Theophilus Lindsey is the guy who really gets a church started, and he'll have the first Unitarian church in London. He was a minister for most of his life, had chances for big promotions. He was going to be fill a vacant pulpit at the Octagon Chapel in Liverpool, or that he had a chance to go to the chapel in Norwich. These were big Church of England parishes, but he was living a lie already at this point in life. He knew that he could not, in good conscience, subscribe to the articles of religion, as would be required if he's changing his church. His friends tell him that he can't go on living a lie. They know that it's really taking a toll on him. He has other friends, not quite as good, it would seem, who then turned their back on him when he resigned his position. He lost many of his friends then. As a way of making up for what he probably thought of as his own apostasy, not being faithful, living a lie, you might say, he puts all of his money into helping the poor and becomes just about destitute in his effort to, you might say, assuage his guilt at not telling the truth about his true beliefs. One day, he gives it up. He resigns his position, and he decides to start a church in London, moves his few remaining belongings, his wife, and they go to London, and they find a church, I should say an empty room. It's an auction house on Essex Street. And there they start the first Unitarian church. And let me back up here and stick with Theophilus for just a few more minutes. He's They stick with the church, or rather start the first church there. 200 people show up on the first Sunday. Among the congregants, Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Priestley, very well known at the time, a famous scientist, and at one point, a Presbyterian, that is, a Calvinist minister, Joseph Priestley, that is, who will later move to the United States after being hounded out of England for becoming a Unitarian. Lindsey's church is a success. When he finally dies, there will be 22 other Unitarian congregations throughout England. Really a success story of a guy who decided he had to tell the truth and go out on a limb and speak his piece. It had a very big effect. And we'll talk more about him next week in our next episode. Joseph Priestley actually gets in on the act. Of course, this is the time shortly after the French Revolution. Both of them, as are many educated people who are against the English monarchy, are praising the French Revolution. And as we'll see next week, that gets them in real trouble. I think we'll close here today. We're running out of storage space on Zoom, and I'm hoping that all this gets recorded so that other folks can take a look at this. Thanks for your attention. And again, Sunday at 1 o'clock, our next episode, we'll finish up in England and make our way to the shores of America. Thanks for being with me. Bye now. And I'll close this out.